Hi, this is Paul Hamilton. I'm going to show you our online training system and how it works. This is unique because it brings you all the way through your ground training and your flight training to get your pilot license.
So we're going to jump right into the course here. So once you buy the course and you start into it, this is where you go. We got the video up here showing how the course works. But first off, we're going to look at the course itself. It's basically broken up into 4 stages. Your stage 1, Trike first flights. Your stage 2, Trike maneuvers and aeronautical knowledge to solo. Stage 3 is where your student pilot, we go over more or less our regulations and our cross country. And then stage 4 here is where we get ready for our knowledge test and our practical test. So let's go in here and just look at what we got. We're going to expand our stage 1. And for stage 1, you see it's broken into a flight lesson and a ground lesson, and then a quiz. So for each flight lesson, this first one does not have a quiz here, but for each flight lesson, we go through the flight lesson, then we take a quiz. We go through the ground lesson, we take a quiz. And all this goes in a logical order here as we go. So if we're going to go in here and just do our first lesson 1, introductory flight. Okay, as we go in here, we can see we've got our introductory flight here. This is where we start, talks to the objectives, the assignment, basically watch the videos. So down here, we've got videos that we watch here. And now this is the old classic video from way back. As we look at this video,
you develop your piloting skills easily and safely.
Then we go into our modern videos. These are recently taken here with the modern Revo here.
Hi, this is Paul Hamilton. Welcome to the Learn to Fly a Trike course. We're going to be doing a lot of flying together. So what we're going to do, we're going to start out.
So there's our video. We can see that goes all the way through.
Some fun. I try and convince you to learn to fly.
Okay, we go through our videos here, and then once we get done here, we go mark complete, and we move on to our next lesson. There we go. Now that we've moved on to our next lesson, one of the things we can notice here, we can see how we're 2% complete. We've done 1 of 47 steps. And again, here we go into our Trike ground lesson 1. We look at our program overview. Now here we talk about weight shift control handbook. Now what happens is we look at that, we can download that book. This is where we can go through that book, read our assignments in there. And what happens is here, start at the beginning of page 1, and you read through page 19 of this book. Okay? Then as we go down for our other assignment here, read and understand the Sport Pilot Certification Basics. Now here I go through and outline the Sport Pilot Certification here. I highlight some of the topics here. Explains what is a light sport aircraft, the whole deal. We get down into our actual regulations down here. And when we get done with that, we also notice down here we've got a study guide. This goes through this is something you can print out. It goes over the program overview, talks about how we go through the course, what we do. This is actually in the training syllabus here. And then what we do is we move on to take our quiz. And we're just going to show you how to go through one of the quizzes right here. What's the minimum flight training hours for a Sport Pilot Certificate? We've got 20 hours of flight training from an authorized instructor and 20 hours of solo flight. That's not correct. 15 hours of flight training from the authorized 5 hours of solo. So we know that so we're going to mark that as a correct answer. Hit next. Can a Sport Pilot fly at night? Well, the answer is no. Next, can a sport fly at larger airports with the control towers? Yes, with the proper endorsements. Okay, is a sport pilot license a real FAA pilot's license? Yes, just like a private and commercial, that's true. Next, now we're going to miss a couple here. How many FAA flight tests are required for a sport pilot certificate? The correct answer is 2. We're going to actually just do 1 here. That's not a correct answer. How many hours minimum ground training are required? We're going to say 20 hours of ground training. That's an incorrect answer also. So we're going to go ahead and finish our quiz. and we get done here, we can see that we only got 4 out of 6. So we only got a 66, so that does not qualify. It takes 70%. So we're going to go ahead and view our questions, and we can go down here and we can see what questions we got right. See, we can see our right ones. We go down here and we can see down here how many FA tests are required for a sport pilot. Well, the correct answer is 2, a knowledge and a practical test. So we learn that right here. And we look at our other incorrect answer here. How many hours minimum ground training required for a sport pilot license certificate? And we can see how the correct answer is no minimum hours requirement for ground training. So we can see how those are incorrect. So we're learning from our mistakes here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back up here, and we want to go ahead and restart quiz. What we're going to do here is we're going to end up taking this again here because we've learned our answers here. So we're going to blast through here. How many hours minimum ground training required? We know that that's the correct answer from last time, which we missed. We're going to finish our quiz, and we can see how we got 100. So we could view questions, restart quiz, click here to continue. And we move on to our next lesson here. Now you notice here we've done 2 of the 47 steps here. We're 4% complete. We can see that right here. And also notice here for navigation, we can go back to our previous lesson. We can go to our next lesson. We can jump around a little bit here. Now another way for navigation is on the left here. We've got all of our, we've got a program menu right here. Now you can see how we've already been through here. We've been through flight lesson 1, ground lesson. We took the quiz, and you can see how now. So we can click on any one of these to bring us to our different lessons. It's another way of navigating. We've got a number of ways to navigate around here. This is always easy. We can go to stage 2, all of our lessons here. Go out of that back to stage 1. Okay, so now we're back to Trike flight lesson 2. Aircraft pre-flight, start, taxi, basic controls. We talk about our objectives here. Read the FAA Weight Shift Control Handbook, Chapter 5, Pre-flight and Ground Operations. Okay, again, we click on that and we click right to our book here. We got our chapters here. So we got our whole chapters here to read that as we go through. We come down here, we go into our videos. We got our Learn to Fly videos. We watch that on how to start, how to pre-flight with our classic videos here. Then we go to our modern videos.
So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going through our first actual flight lesson here. So the first thing is here we make sure that we follow our checklist. And we got our checklist right here. We're looking at that.
Now before we get too far along here, as far as checklist goes, that's a video for our first flight, another 15-minute modern video here. Again, we got our study guide, completion standards, and again we go down, then we would of course take our quiz, and again we've got our quiz for our flight lesson right here that we go down through that. And we move to our ground lesson 2, basic aerodynamics. Here we go into our weight shift control pilot's handbook of aeronautical knowledge. We look at our principles of flight, and we move through our principles of flight. Here are all of our basics here, and I've done a whole bunch of rework on the FAA Pilot's Handbook to really show Newton's second law, which I think is just as important as Bernoulli's principle. So there's the principles of flight, and then of course we go into our aerodynamics of flight. In our book, we got our aerodynamics of flight here, again written specifically for the Trike. How that works, the aerodynamics here, forces acting on the aircraft, lift and drag, all the stuff here through the whole book, our thrust lines. And as you can see, we move you through all the specifics that are really specific to Trike here and understanding. And of course, after chapters 3 and 4 out of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, we move down to the FAA Weight Shift Control Flying Handbook, Chapter 2, Aerodynamics. And we've got all that, all your basics for your weight shift control. And again, for each lesson, we've got our study guide here. This is just a summary of things to study. It's got all your basics down here. This is right out of the training syllabus, all your principles here to go over to learn and understand. And then, of course, we go down and take the quiz. And we can go to our next lesson. Trike Flight Lesson 3, Basic Maneuvers. And again, we've got our, we read our book here, we go through our videos, we've got our classic videos, and then we've got our brand new videos.
So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working on straight level. Now that we've got it down, that the throttles makes us climb and descend. The bars are speed. We're going to start working on straight level.
So we got a whole long video here. Well, 6-minute here for this particular one. What you notice here is for every single lesson, flight lessons here, we bring you through the old classic ultralight videos plus brand new videos here also. And same, when we get done watching our video here and reading our materials, we take a quiz to get through this portion here to make sure we understand the information, learn what we didn't learn, and move on to our next lesson. Now our next lesson is going to be a ground lesson. And we get into our next ground lesson here, aircraft and systems. Again, we read the weight shift control, pilot's handbook, aeronautical knowledge. Here we've got aircraft systems, flight instruments. We also read the manufacturer's pilot operating handbook. Now what I've done here is, since I fly the Revo, I've also got that as a pilot operating handbook to go to. Now this is part of your lessons to read here, to actually go through your pilot's operating handbook. Now if you've got a different aircraft than that, you can just go ahead and read that, because it tells you specifically the sections to go through, general limitations. Okay, and as we go on down here, we're going to go through the weight shift control flying handbook, chapter 3 and chapter 4. And now we start to get you into the test prep and prepware sections of the aircraft system. Now this is where you're going to be going through your actual FAA test prep questions. And again, here we've got our videos down below here of our instruments. Now, one of the other things too is I've included our whole Rotex training course video. We've got Rotex Part 1, Rotex Part 2, Oils and Systems, right from old Phil Lockwood and Dean Vogel here, our experts. So we go through our cooling systems, everything, electric system. We go on, we talk about the differences in the 912 fuel injection. So we really cover the Rotex engine in great detail here, along with our aircraft systems. So here we've got a really comprehensive aircraft and systems section. And again, of course, you go down, we take the quiz, move on to our next lesson, and that's going to be our next flight lesson. So here we are, flight lesson, flight environment, normal takeoffs and departure climbs. Again, through our classic videos here, and we go down to our modern videos here. We got I've got one video here, takeoff and patterns, another new video here on minimum controlled airspeed and trim. It'll give you a flavor.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to work on slow flight. Now,
there we go. So all kinds of so basically what we do on all of our flight lessons, we go through the flight lessons just as if you were flying with me. These are the flight lessons I go through with all the students here. And of course, once we get done here, we go through another quiz here for flight lesson 4. Then we hit our next lesson, and that should be a ground lesson. And here we get into our Trike ground lesson 4, regulations, procedures, and operations. Okay, now here's where we start to introduce you to the regulations here. Weight shift control flying handbook, chapter 1 through talks about positive transfer of controls. Now we look at part 9. We've already looked at part 61 for pilot capabilities. Now we're going to look at part 91. Now what I've done here is I've just provided the actual regulations from part 91. If you click on this part 91, it'll bring you actually to the current government regulations. This is right out of the Code of Federal Regulations here. So what I've done here is I've basically taken the regulations that are important for a sport pilot, put them out here so you can go down through those one by one. These are a lot of common sense here. Again, we got our study guide of what regulations to look at. Our quiz here that we go through. Move on to our next lesson. That was a ground lesson. So the next we're going to have a flight lesson. And we go up to our Trike Flight Lesson 5, Advanced Maneuvers and Stalls here, okay? We've got our old classic videos here, and then of course we've got our brand new modern video here, Flight Lesson 5, Stalls and Steep Turns, your advanced maneuvers. And again, our study guide of what we want to study here. We got our quiz here, and then we move on to our next lesson. Now our next lesson here is weather. So here we go through our whole weather course here. Got our what to study here for in our books, our weather theory here. Again, our typical weather theory here that we've got our books to go through. And we also go through our complete weather to fly system here. Okay, we've got our weather to fly global energy engine talking about how the weather works. We have a quiz here. Now when we move on to our next lesson, now we're looking at weather information resources and our pre-flight prep. In other words, what we're looking at to plan our flight here. We got our old classic video, weather to fly video here. And of course, I've also got some updates here with your modern technology and even your portable device, how to look at your weather on your portable devices. So I go through and show you how to work some of the things. I actually use 4Flight on this. Again, we go through it, take a quiz. We go to our next lesson in our weather to fly system, and that's weather observing your local weather. Again, we go into our classic video here, which shows our basics of how we work. Look at our weather theory, chapter 11, take another quiz, and move on to that next lesson. So basically, we're going through each weather to fly portion here. Okay, now we come into with the weather to fly system of weather to fly. We go over part 3 here, which talks about weather to fly. We go over our mental attitude, all the things building up to that. Again, a quiz, move on to our next lesson. And then we actually talk about weather to fly, the actual flight, how to analyze our weather predictions once we go up to fly. Another quiz, move on to our next lesson. And this is where we do our analysis of our flight in our weather to fly system. Again, take our quiz. Now, as you notice here, at this point, we've actually completed our whole stage 1. So what we would do at this point is we would mark this stage 1 complete. And now we move on to stage 2, ground reference maneuvers. Oh, we'll go in and look at that here for flight. There's a 10-minute long video here.
Okay, so we're going to get ready for some ground reference maneuvers here. We got a nice straight line here, or maybe our 11 o'clock here. We're going to use that. Right now. And we're going to use 60 miles an hour as our speed. Okay, so we're coming across that. Now, that's exactly perpendicular. So we're going to start that turn here, and we're going to keep...
There you go. So you can see we go through every single flight lesson here in great detail with modern high-def videos. Take the quiz here, move on to our next lesson. Aircraft performance, weight, and balance, okay? Again, we've got our assignments here. We read in our books. Go down. We talk about performance. We go to our Pilot's Operating Handbook. We can see that. I added a couple of supplemental charts here, which are hard to find here to get back to our basics of performance here. I think those are helpful. Go back in, we take a quiz, we go into our next lesson. Okay, Crosswinds, takeoff track. Again, so now we're going out and we're of course reading our chapters here. We look at our video here. So now I got a video on crosswinds. That's an 8-minute video. Look at that real quick here. So what we're going to do here today is we're going to fly in some crosswinds. Now, of course, around here the problem is when we get crosswinds, we've also got bumps. So the wind wants to push us into the runway, so to stay parallel. There we go. We talk about that. Now, when we turn onto our base, we're going to be going faster than normal, so we have to be quick and not wait too long so that we don't get drifted past the runway. Take our quiz, move on to our next lesson here. which is going to be a ground lesson. And this is going to be aeromedical, aeronautical decision making here. And we read our chapters. We've got our weight shift control, pilot's handbook, aeronautical knowledge chapters here. And again, we go into our prepware where we're practicing our FAA questions. We go into our weight shift control flying handbook chapter. We got our study guide. We go through, again, take a quiz, move on to our next lesson. And now we're going to be talking about trike flying into airport patterns. And we've got our weight shift control handbook, chapter 10, chapter 11, approaches. We look at our pilot's handbook, aeronautical knowledge, chapter 11. And I've actually got a script here for airport communications and operations. Now this is part of how I teach airport operations and radio communications. Now if you notice here, a bunch of tips here to look at, and this is an actual script of how to talk on the radio. And so you can practice this, you can print this out. This is great for learning how to talk on the radio. This is where a lot of people have trouble. So we've got an actual script that you follow here. Then we go in here, of course we got our classic video here of airport operations, and then we've got our high def video here, flying in the pattern.
Carson CD traffic, cruiser 9, Charlie Sierra, taking off runway 27, remaining in the pattern.
Okay, so we've got a lot of activity going here, and we're going to monitor AWAS so we don't miss any transmissions here. So there we go.
Carson City Airport. Automated weather observations 174 Zulu. Wind calm. Visibility.
There we go. We got all kinds of things going on here.
27 looking for traffic.
Trying to keep track of everybody.
3 Echoes, midfield left downwind, runway 27, Carson. We'll go behind you, Bonanza.
Okay. Roger. Dynamite Alpha turning, right base for runway 27, full stop.
Okay, so here we're low approach here.
Carson traffic, Fairchild 221.
Okay, now you can see how we're really in the super action here of getting to listen to the radio calls, the whole thing. Got our study guide again. Quiz, move on to our next lesson. Okay, ground lesson, airspace. Now, of course, airspace is a tough one for everybody. So what I've done is I did a whole course on airspace here. So as we go through the airspace here, we've got weight shift control handbook. We reference our FAA handbook here. We've also got our pilot's handbook, aeronautical knowledge. And when we go through our airspace, now this is a complete course on airspace. So when you get done with this, you really understand it here. We're starting our airspace intro here. Take our quiz, move on to our next lesson. Here we talk about uncontrolled Class G airspace and Class E controlled airspace. Now, what I did with this whole airspace course is show how and why. And so what we'll do is we'll go into the video here and we'll look at that, how that actually happens. When flight started, there were very few aircraft in the air. We all flew around, and generally, if we could see at least 1 mile, stay out of clouds, stay away from terrain, and look around for other air traffic, we could see and avoid and fly safely. However, as aviation evolved, we had to get somewhere in less than optimum conditions. Before we knew it, we were flying in the clouds with the use of gyroscopic instruments. Now, see and avoid would not work, especially at or around airports where air traffic became more dense. Now, in the 1950s, with aircraft radio communication possible, the government established controlled airspace routes to be monitored and controlled by people on the ground, commonly known as ATC, air traffic control. Simply, these were Victor airways from radio navigation beacons, VOR stations, VHF, which are omnidirectional range, typically located near airports. These still exist today. These controlled airspace airways were 8 nautical miles wide and 1,200 feet above the ground. These Victor airways still exist and are shown on the sectional today and still used for navigation. So that gives you an idea about how the airspace course works, telling how, so it's much easier to understand. So we'll move along here. We'll go down and take the ground lesson test, move on to our next lesson. And once we talk about our controlled and uncontrolled, now we're going to go into a section here that talks about cloud clearances, okay? Because that's very, very hard to understand for many people here, so I've broken it down into very, very easy to understand for the different airspaces. So by the time you get done with this section here, you're going to really understand cloud clearances for airspace. Again, another quiz. Move on to our next lesson, which is talking about airspace, how you have controlled, how it drops to the surface and how it goes above 1200 AGL. Section on that, why it is, who it's for. Another quiz on that. Move on to our next lesson. And here's where we start talking about radio communication. So we go into our how to talk on the radio. A little bit more on that with our video here. It should be understood that at Class E controlled airports and Class G uncontrolled airports, that communication is not required by law. This is because some of the early airplanes did not have electric circuits to power a radio, and the FAA has not made a rule update that would require a radio in every aircraft flying into Class E and Class G airports. However, as far as I'm concerned, for safety, every aircraft should be communicating with each other to avoid... There you go. So that's my theory on communications, and we've been over communications here. You've been listening to communications. Again, so we take a quiz on that. That's a very short section here. Move on to our next lesson on airspace. Now we talked about tower-controlled airspace here. And of course, we've got our chapters to read, and we actually talk about what is tower-controlled airspace. This is actually Reno right here. So a little discussion on that. This is only like a 2-minute video here. It's good for you to understand what the difference is between tower-controlled airspace and controlled airspace. And we go over that in great detail. Again, a quiz. Next lesson. And we blast through Class D towered airspace with a quiz. Next lesson, Class C tower-controlled airspace. Now for sport pilots, you just have to figure out where it is and stay away from it. This video also covers how to operate within the airspace, but if you're not going to be operating in the airspace, you don't need that, but it's there. Again, a quiz on Class C airspace. Move on to our next lesson. Okay, Class B tower-controlled airspaces for the big airports here, and we talk about that in great detail, Class B. Take our quiz, and more on airspace. We talked about a controlled airspace scenario. Here's where we go over in pretty good detail some of the, we actually talk about this little airport down here, whether you can get in. We've got flying around complex controlled airspace if you're into that. Part 1 and 2 in a sim, and we've got some examples of flying into Class C airspace here. You know, if you want to do that. This may or may not be for you. If you don't want airspace flying into, you don't have to look at that. But we talk about that. Quiz, next lesson, and we finish up our airspace with special use airspace. Talking about that. Of course, a video on that. Quiz, next lesson, other airspace. Go over that in detail. Of course, a quiz, next lesson. There we go. So now we're going to be talking about Trike Ground Lesson 9, Emergency Operations and Equipment, where we look at Chapter 13, Weight Shift Control Flying, Abnormal and Emergency Conditions here, our ground lesson, quiz, next lesson, and we move on to our Advanced Takeoffs, Landings, and Emergency Operations. Now this is where we go over takeoff, departure in crosswinds, approaches and landings, rejected landings. Okay, we also talk about our advanced flight maneuvers and spirals, go-arounds, basically emergency operations. So we have a pretty lengthy video here, 29 minutes on all that. Emergency operations, like I say, including power-off landings, go-arounds, spirals, all your flight maneuvers necessary for emergency operations. another quiz on that. Now, if you notice, we've been through stage 1 and 2 here. We've completed stage 2 all the way down here, and we would mark complete here and go to the next stage here. And another way to navigate here, we could go to stage 3, click on that, click down here, and go to Trike Flight Lesson 10, Solo Requirements. Now, to review here, stage 1 is our first trike flight, stage 2 is trike maneuvers and aeronautical knowledge to solo. Now, stage 3 is where we're actually soloing, and we do look at our regulations in a little bit more detail, and we go cross country. So as we go in here, we can see that our Trike Flight Lesson 10 is our solo requirements. This is where we go into some of our details of what's necessary to solo. And we talk about choosing your own trike here for solo. Quiz, we move on to our next lesson. And now we talked about some of our trike ground lesson. We talk about some of our limits and regulations here. This is where we go through a little bit more of our Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, what to study in that. A little bit more with our regulations now, since you're going to be flying pilot command. Take a quiz, move on to our next lesson. Now here we start talking about our cross-country flight planning. This is where we go through, we actually read up on doing our classical paper flight planning. Now I added another video here. We got modern flight planning using portable devices. We talk about that. Nice video on how to plan a flight using some of our modern technology. This is kind of like an idiot box. It makes it so easy to do cross-country planning, but we want you to have your basics down to be able to do this, because if your batteries go dead or you actually need to do a cross-country flight, you need to be able to use your charts. So we start with those basics. Take a quiz, move on to our next lesson. Now our next lesson here is where we actually are going to be doing the cross-country training. So we've got one of our old classic videos here that talks about that. And then what we do is we actually go on a cross-country flight. Now this is where we do the whole flight. It's actually an hour-and-a-half flight here, but I shortened that down to our video in 50 minutes, where we use our flight plan to do our whole cross-country flight. Quiz about that. Go on to our next lesson. We get into our cross-country solo. This is where we talk about what's cross-country, what's solo, how to meet your sport pilot requirements for that. Take a quiz, get on to our next lesson. We go in a little bit more in depth into our en route weather here. This is where we look at our weather services in greater detail. Take a quiz on that. Then we're actually finished with this stage. And so what we've done here is we just finished our stage 3, which is the student pilot. We'll go over some of our regulations in greater detail, and you do your cross country. Now we're going to move on to stage 4, which is where we get ready to take our weight shift control knowledge test and check ride. There's really only 3 lessons right here. We do our practical test standards here. Flight lesson 13, practical test standards simulation. This is where we actually go through and we look at our practical test standards, which is the FAA requirements. We actually go through our check ride book. We've got parts 1 and 2. This is the Sport Pilot check ride book. We've got all the questions and all the answers for the check ride. Okay, and we talk about getting to the check ride as part 1. Part 2 of this book is all the possible questions for oral questioning, certificates and documents, airworthiness, all the stuff we've been over already, putting into a check ride format for you to understand. And then the flight tasks, pre-flight, airport operations, takeoffs and landings. So this is everything you need to go through a check ride. We've got our old classic check ride video on how to actually get through the check ride, and then there's another video here on getting through the actually going through all the maneuvers for a check ride. We go on to our next lesson. Our next lesson is our knowledge exam. This is where we go through and use our prepware to go through, get our endorsement, go down, take our knowledge test to get through our actual knowledge test. A couple questions there. We go into our next lesson. Now, after you pass your knowledge test, go on to our course completion. This is where you've completed the course. We look at what's next. and you can go ahead and get your certificate. Here we've been through all of our stage 1, which is our first Trike flights. We've been through stage 2, flight maneuvers and aeronautical knowledge solo, looked at all our lessons there. Gone through our Trike student pilot regulations to cross country. Been through all those lessons here. And stage 4, weight shift control knowledge test and practical test to pass the check ride. There we go. So there's your review of what the course is all about.
So there we go. With this system, you have me along the way, just a phone call away. Sign up and begin your incredible journey.